Hi, in this video I'm going to go over a recent illustration that I recorded the process for. The video will be time-lapse. The original painting was about 5 hours in length, so I would class it as a speed painting or sketch. To start off the painting, I throw down my custom brushes to create some texture and forms on the canvas. At this stage I don't know what I want to paint, other than it will be a landscape of some type. Generally I like to try and establish some interesting textures, focal points and place a sky and ground plane. This all helps to generate ideas and context for the painting. I use the wand tool frequently to create random selections of the information on the canvas. I then do a copy merge and use the texture to add visual interest, new forms as well as interesting texture and shape interactions to the painting. Around this stage I notice that I'm getting leaf and tree shapes start to appear, so I play around with this going forward. I tend to block the silhouette of a form in first, and then I add abstract texture on a clipping layer or pixel lock, and from there I start painting form on top of that. Here I am establishing a foreground element. I try to establish a path through the painting to help guide the viewer to points of interest, and also think of the landscape as an actual environment that can be navigated through. I am using the transform tools to help force some perspective into the abstract textures created, as this helps ground the abstract painting into a more realistic context moving forward, and helps to further establish recognisable forms for generating ideas. I add colour variation into the illustration using the colour balance tools on an abstract textured layer. As you can see, I'm starting to get this idea of creating an environment of overgrown trees. I also established depth using perspective and atmospheric perspective. As mentioned in my previous video, one of the downsides of this process is that it does require a lot of cleanup to get it to work well. As the selections are random, I end up with different values across the illustration, so I have to constantly fix these as I go. A lot of my abstraction process is similar to matte painting, in that you have to adjust each image you add to the illustration to make it fit. In my case, I'm doing the same thing for each texture I add. I extend the canvas to help the composition breathe a bit. I do this using a crop tool, and then I use the smudge tool to give a base colour that matches the landscape. After this, I add some random textures to the new area and begin painting some of the forms on top. Here I am trying to bring out the texture of the rock by copy merging a texture onto a new layer and increasing the contrast. I then play around with the opacity and soft light layers to get the result I want. I also do this for the entire painting by upping the contrast and playing around with the layers again, just to give more depth to the piece and more contrast to the textures. I use the medium tool to get rid of some of the excessive detail as it was starting to look too busy. It also has the benefit of merging the smaller unnecessary shapes created by my process into larger ones, which helps the texture and overall illustration have a better read. Here I focus a bit more on establishing the shadow and light. I'm also limiting the colour palette to make everything in the scene fit together a bit better. I tend to jump around the illustration as I paint, bringing everything up to the same level of detail as I go. This is a good habit to get into as it helps you see the overall picture moving forward. Here I didn't actually know what I wanted to do, so I started blocking in some water with a textured brush. I quickly realised the way I had blocked it in looks like webs, so I went with that. Naturally, adding webs meant I needed a spider or some other creature in the scene. I designed the creature by painting a silhouette and then overlaying abstract texture and finally painting over it. I started cleaning up the foreground a bit more and improving the composition by having the roots lead into the scene. After this, I started working on the middle ground of the painting. I didn't know what I wanted to paint there, so I used the abstraction process again. A lot of this section of the painting involved separating out the elements of the illustration and adding depth by adjusting the values and adding atmospheric perspective. I started adding some vegetation into the scene to add some variety, contrast, and also to use a composition element to lead the viewer around the illustration. Later on, I used the one tool on the vegetation I painted in the foreground to give an interesting texture as a base to paint on for the vegetation in the background. Then I used my custom brushes and overpainting to render. At this stage, I'm at the end of my first painting session, which was about 1 hour 40 minutes. The next session was about an hour. I tend to split up my painting sessions based on a variety of factors, but in general it does help to give some perspective on what you're painting when you take a break. This session and the next were mostly spent cleaning up the foreground and middle ground and rendering. I also improved the composition by moving and adding elements to the painting. The background was pretty flat and undefined, so I started painting that as well. In the right hand corner, where I have extended the canvas, it looks like a separate scene is happening that is not connected to the middle ground. To fix this, I paint the middle ground elements into the negative space of the foreground elements. This helps to join the scenes together. I start defining the form of the tree root in the foreground by using the colour of the sky to paint the top planes. I also start painting in some vegetation in the left hand corner to create a contrasting path through the illustration. I then start cleaning up the vegetation in the middle ground, as right now it's very loose and undefined. I decided to repaint the foreground at this point, as having roots everywhere was a bit boring. So I added some loose rocks and some soft earth textures to give an area of rest between all the new details. The last 3 hours were basically just cleaning up the image and rendering, so I'll speed up the time lapse quite a bit. The biggest change was adding the vines at the top of the scene. I did this to add a framing element to the composition. Since I have all these vertical shapes leading out of the scene, I needed something to stop the viewer and put them back into the action. A lot of the final process is focused on making sure everything in the scene is communicated clearly to the viewer. So here is the final illustration again. If I were to take this further, it would essentially just be more rendering of all the elements in the scene, making sure all the textures and forms read when zoomed in. I hope this video was helpful. Now just for a bit of self-promotion, if you like the look of the custom brushes I'm using here, they are now available on my ArtStation and Gumroad page. See the description or my link tree for a link. There were over 260 hand-painted brushes in the set with a focus on landscape textures and effects. Just under 3 hours of real-time tutorials on using brushes and example illustrations included on multiple PSDs.